They banned me from Christmas dinner, called me the family embarrassment, but when Colonel Martinez stood up at the community Christmas gala and said my name with such reverence that the entire room fell silent, my sister Sarah's champagne glass slipped right out of her manicured fingers. The crystal shattered against the polished floor of the grand ballroom, each piece catching the light from the massive Christmas tree like tiny fallen stars. And in that moment, I watched 27 years of her assumptions about me crumble just as completely. I need you to stay with me through this story because what happened that night changed everything I thought I knew about family, about worth, and about the quiet power of simply showing up when everyone expects you to disappear. Drop a comment and let me know you're listening. Tell me where you're hearing this from, because this story traveled further than I ever imagined it could, and I love knowing how these moments of truth reach people in the most unexpected places. The Christmas ban didn't happen overnight, you understand. It was years in the making, a slow erosion of belonging that started the moment I chose a different path than the golden children Sarah and Michael had carved out for themselves. Sarah with her corner office at the law firm, Michael with his medical practice, and his perfect suburban house with the circular driveway that our mother loved to brag about to her book club friends. They had the kind of success that photographs, well, for Christmas cards, the kind that makes relatives nod approvingly at family gatherings while asking when I might finally get my act together. I was 22 when I first missed Christmas dinner, not because I was banned yet, but because I was deployed overseas with a unit that needed me more than my family's dining room table did. Sarah rolled her eyes when I called from the satellite phone, told me I was just making excuses to avoid responsibility again, that normal people don't run away from their families during the holidays. She couldn't understand why I would choose to spend Christmas in a place where mortars might interrupt midnight mass, where the closest thing to snow was the dust that settled on everything we owned. When I came back that first time, thinner and quieter, carrying invisible weight they couldn't see, Michael patted my shoulder with the kind of condescending sympathy he reserved for his most hopeless patients. He suggested I might want to consider therapy, maybe some medication to help with whatever was clearly going wrong in my head. Sarah nodded along, adding that military service was fine and all, but at some point I needed to think about my future, about building something real instead of playing soldier in places that didn't matter to anyone back home. That second deployment lasted 18 months, and when I returned for Christmas that year, my seat at the table had been quietly reassigned to Sarah's new boyfriend. No one mentioned it directly, but the message was clear in the way conversations stopped when I entered rooms, in the way my mother's eyes slid past me when she talked about her children's accomplishments to the neighbors who dropped by with holiday cookies. The third time I missed Christmas, they stopped asking why. I was in Walter Reed by then, recovering from injuries that would earn me medals and never talked about, working through physical therapy that made every step feel like a small victory they would never understand. Sarah visited once, spent 20 minutes checking her phone and complaining about the hospital parking fees before telling me she hoped I was finally learning that actions have consequences. Michael never visited at all, but he sent a card with a generic message about hoping I would find my way back to being the person he remembered from before I started making such poor choices. The person he remembered was 18 and uncertain, eager to please and desperate for approval that felt increasingly impossible to earn. The person I was becoming in that hospital bed was someone who had carried wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire, someone who had made decisions that saved lives while my family wondered why I couldn't manage to hold down a regular job. By the time I was medically retired, the family narrative about me was set in stone. I was the one who couldn't commit to anything, who drifted from place to place without purpose, who had wasted his 20s on some misguided adventure that had clearly damaged him in ways he was too proud to admit. When I moved into the small apartment across town and started what they assumed was another dead-end job, their disappointment had crystallized into something harder than mere concern. Sarah got married that spring in a ceremony I attended but wasn't asked to participate in, sitting in the back row next to distant cousins who knew enough not to ask too many questions about what I did for work. During her reception speech, she thanked everyone who had supported her through the years, her voice catching with emotion as she mentioned how grateful she was for family who had always been there for her. Her eyes never found mine in the crowd. Michael's engagement party that summer was held at the country club, and I wore my one good suit while listening to him tell his future in-laws about his successful medical practice and his sister's thriving legal career. When someone asked about his other sibling, he gave a practice smile and said I was still figuring things out, still trying different things, the way some people just need more time to find their place in the world. His fiancée nodded sympathetically and said she had a cousin like that, someone who just couldn't seem to settle down into adult responsibilities. The job they thought was dead-end was actually consulting work for the Department of Defense. Contracts that required security clearances they didn't know I had, projects that involved traveling to places I couldn't discuss, with people who didn't understand that some work happens in shadows by necessity. The apartment, though, why pitted, was deliberately modest, chosen because most of my income went to other purposes they never asked about: support for families of fallen soldiers, donations to veteran organizations, investments in a future they couldn't imagine because I had never learned how to explain it in ways that would impress them. When my mother started planning her 60th birthday party that fall, the guest list went through several revisions. Sarah showed me the final version over coffee one afternoon, pointing out how she had managed to seat everyone strategically to avoid awkward conversations. My name wasn't on the seating chart at all, and when I asked about it, she sighed and explained that sometimes family gatherings worked better when everyone who attended was in a similar place in life, when the conversation could flow naturally without anyone feeling left out or uncomfortable. The Christmas band came officially that December, delivered by Michael during what he called a family intervention, but felt more like a trial where I wasn't allowed to present evidence in my defense. They had decided, the three of them, that my presence at holiday gatherings had become too disruptive, that my inability to contribute meaningfully to conversations about careers and achievements was bringing down the mood for everyone else. Sarah added that it wasn't personal, just practical, that maybe once I got my life together, we could revisit the situation. They were worried about me, they said, concerned that I was stuck in some kind of arrested development that family obligations might be enabling. Michael suggested that missing a few holidays might provide the motivation I needed to make some real changes, to consider what kind of life I actually wanted to build instead of whatever I was doing now that seemed to lead nowhere anyone could understand. I listened to their concerns with the same patience I had learned in briefing rooms where lives hung in the balance of careful decisions, where speaking too quickly could reveal information that needed to stay classified. They interpreted my silence as acceptance, maybe even relief, not understanding that some things are too important to defend with words when actions will eventually speak louder than any argument I could have made that night. That Christmas morning, I woke up in my quiet apartment and made coffee the way they had taught us in survival training, strong and black, and designed to keep you alert through whatever the day might bring. I thought about calling them, about driving over anyway with the gifts I'd already wrapped, but instead I opened my laptop and looked at the invitation that had arrived 3 days earlier, the one they didn't know about. The community Christmas gala was being held at the Grand Ballroom downtown, a charity event supporting local veteran organizations that my family probably didn't even know existed despite living in the same city for 30 years. The invitation was addressed to me personally, signed by people whose names would mean nothing to Sarah and Michael, but represented connections they couldn't imagine, relationships built through service and sacrifice they had never bothered to understand. I spent that Christmas day preparing for an evening that would change everything, pressing the dress uniform I hadn't worn since my retirement ceremony, polishing boots that still held memories of places my family thought were just exotic locations where I had wasted my youth. The medals in the box felt heavier than usual, each one representing moments when other people's children came home because of decisions I had made in darkness they would never see. The invitation said there would be a special recognition ceremony, something about honoring local heroes who preferred to work without fanfare, people whose contributions to the community often went unnoticed by everyone except those whose lives they had touched. I had no idea I was on that list, no understanding that my quiet work since returning home had been noticed by anyone who mattered, let alone people important enough to organize events at places like the Grand Ballroom. As the sun set on that Christmas evening, I adjusted my tie one final time and looked at myself in the mirror, seeing not the family disappointment my siblings had described, but the person I had actually become through choices they had never bothered to understand. The man looking back at me had carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire, had counseled veterans through their darkest moments, had quietly contributed to his community in ways that didn't photograph well for holiday cards, but mattered more than any corner office or suburban mansion. I drove downtown through streets decorated with Christmas lights, past houses where families were probably finishing their holiday dinners, past the restaurant where I knew my family was celebrating without me for the first time in 27 years. The grand ballroom glowed with warm light when I arrived, and I could see through the tall windows that the event was already well underway. People in the evening were mingling beneath crystal chandeliers and a Christmas tree that made the one in my childhood home look like a decoration from a discount store. Walking through those doors felt like crossing a threshold between the person my family thought I was and the person I had actually become, between their narrow definition of success and the broader understanding of worth that I had learned in places they would never visit, from people they would never meet. The moment I stepped inside, I could see familiar faces from my consulting work, colleagues from veteran organizations, people who knew exactly who I was and what I had contributed to their world even when I wasn't wearing a uniform that made it obvious. And there, across the room, near the dessert table, I spotted Sarah and Michael with their spouses, dressed in their finest clothes and clearly trying to network their way into whatever social circle they thought this event represented. They had no idea I would be there, no understanding that this gathering existed in a world where their kind of success was less impressive than the quiet dedication they had dismissed as aimlessness for so many years. Colonel Martinez was approaching the podium as I found my assigned seat, his voice carrying easily across the crowded ballroom as he began to speak about service and sacrifice, about people who answered calls to duty that most Americans never heard. I watched my family's faces as they listened politely to words that probably sounded like generic military rhetoric to them, having no idea that everything he was saying was about to become very personal very quickly, in ways that would force them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the brother and son they had banned from Christmas dinner. Colonel Martinez's voice filled the ballroom with the kind of authority that comes from decades of commanding respect in situations where lives depend on clear communication, and I felt that familiar straightening of spine that happens automatically when you've spent years responding to that particular tone. He was talking about the invisible heroes among us, the people who serve their communities without fanfare, without expectation of recognition, simply because they understand that true strength shows itself in quiet dedication rather than loud proclamation. I could see Michael leaning forward slightly, probably hoping to make a good impression on whoever might be watching, his doctor's instinct for networking activated by the formal setting and distinguished speaker. Sarah was scanning the room with a calculated assessment she brought to every social situation, cataloging faces and connections that might prove useful for her legal practice, completely unaware that her dismissed brother was sitting 3 tables away in a dress uniform that told a story she had never bothered to read. The full truth of what I had been doing for the past 8 years began to unfold in my mind, like a classified briefing being declassified moment by moment. Each memory sharp with details I had never been allowed to share with anyone who didn't have the proper security clearance to understand. That first deployment they had dismissed as running away from responsibility had been to a forward operating base, where I spent 18 months coordinating medical evacuations under enemy fire, learning to make split-second decisions about triage and transport that meant the difference between someone's child coming home or not. I remember the night when mortar rounds started falling just as we were loading a critically injured Marine onto a helicopter, how the pilot was ready to lift off without me, but I stayed behind to carry a second wounded soldier who couldn't walk, running across open ground while explosions lit up the darkness around us. The medal they gave me for that night was sitting in a box in my apartment, along with commendations I had earned for actions my family would never understand, because they involved carrying people to safety instead of carrying briefcases to corner offices. Sarah had called that deployment a waste of time, a failure to commit to building a real career, But what she didn't know was that 3 families in our hometown had their sons come home because of decisions I made in places where Christmas morning meant checking for improvised explosive devices before the supply convoy could deliver mail from home. The second deployment she had complained about during my hospital visit was actually classified operations in Afghanistan, where I spent 2 years training local forces to protect villages from insurgent attacks. Work that saved hundreds of civilian lives but couldn't be discussed at family dinner tables. The injuries that put me in Walter Reed weren't from some random accident like my family assumed, but from the day I chose to stay behind with a wounded Afghan interpreter who had risked his life to help American forces, carrying him through 2 miles of hostile territory while taking fire from positions we couldn't see. The shrapnel scars on my back told stories of heroism that my brother, the doctor, had looked at during my recovery and seen only as evidence that I was making poor life choices that led to preventable harm. Michael had suggested therapy for what he assumed was combat trauma, never understanding that the real trauma wasn't from what I had experienced in war zones, but from coming home to a family who saw my service as a character flaw rather than a calling to something larger than myself. The quiet strength that had gotten me through months of physical therapy, learning to walk properly again, while dealing with nerve damage that would never completely heal, wasn't something they recognized as resilience because it didn't translate into the kind of success they understood. When I was medically retired with full honors, the ceremony was attended by generals and fellow soldiers who understood exactly what those ribbons on my chest represented. But my family wasn't there because I had stopped trying to explain things they were determined to misinterpret. The consulting work they thought was another dead-end job was actually contracts with the Department of Defense worth more money than Michael made in his medical practice. Analyzing intelligence and developing strategies for operations I still couldn't discuss with anyone who didn't have a need to know. The apartment they pitted was modest by choice, not necessity, because most of my substantial income went to causes they never asked about, supporting families of soldiers who didn't come home, funding scholarships for military children, contributing to veteran mental health programs that saved lives in ways that didn't show up in newspaper headlines. I had quietly become one of the largest individual donors to veteran organizations in our state, writing checks that helped build housing for homeless veterans, fund service dog training programs, and provide emergency assistance for military families facing financial crises. The traveling they assumed was aimless wandering was actually speaking engagements at military academies and veteran conferences, sharing expertise that helped train the next generation of soldiers and support those transitioning back to civilian life. I had testified before congressional committees about veteran affairs, consulted with nonprofits about best practices for helping combat veterans, and worked with researchers studying post-traumatic stress in ways that advanced treatment for thousands of people my family would never meet. Colonel Martinez was telling the audience about someone who had spent years working behind the scenes to transform veteran support services in our community, someone whose quiet dedication had created programs that were now being replicated in cities across the country. I realized with growing awareness that he was describing work I had done, initiatives I had funded, programs I had helped design during countless hours spent in meetings my family assumed were just more evidence of my inability to hold down a regular job. Sarah and Michael were listening politely, but without real interest, the way people do when speakers talk about causes that seem worthy but distant from their own concerns, having no idea that the brother they had banned from Christmas dinner was sitting in this ballroom because his work had earned him recognition from people who understood the true meaning of service and sacrifice. The man Colonel Martinez was praising for transforming how their community supported returning veterans was the same person they had described as lost and directionless, someone who couldn't seem to figure out how to build a meaningful life. The truth was that I had been building something far more meaningful than either of them could imagine, creating systems and programs that would outlast any legal case Sarah might win or any patient Michael might treat, contributing to solutions for problems that affected thousands of families dealing with the aftermath of military service. My work had helped establish the Veteran Crisis Hotline that operated 24 hours a day, funded the construction of transitional housing that had sheltered over 200 homeless veterans, and created job training programs that had placed former military personnel in sustainable careers. I had spent Christmas mornings for the past 3 years volunteering at the Veterans Shelter downtown, serving breakfast to men and women who understood what it meant to serve something larger than yourself. People who recognize the quiet dignity that comes from choosing duty over comfort, sacrifice over safety. Those Christmas mornings had been more meaningful than any family gathering could have been, filled with conversations about resilience and brotherhood that my siblings would never understand because they had never been tested by circumstances that revealed what they were truly made of. The irony of sitting in this elegant ballroom, surrounded by community leaders who knew exactly who I was and what I had contributed, while my family sat unaware, just across the room, was not lost on me. They had excluded me from their celebration because they thought I had nothing valuable to offer, no accomplishments worth sharing with their successful friends, no stories that would reflect well on the family name they were so concerned about protecting. But the people who mattered, the people who understood the difference between success and significance, had invited me to this gala specifically because of contributions they wanted to honor publicly. The invitation in my pocket was signed by the mayor, the city council president, and 3 generals who had worked with me on veteran affairs initiatives, people whose recognition meant more than any family dinner invitation could have. Colonel Martinez was describing a consulting project that had revolutionized how military hospitals handled veteran mental health care, work that had saved lives across multiple states and was being studied by healthcare systems internationally. I had spent 2 years developing those protocols, drawing on my own experience with combat trauma and recovery to create approaches that treated the whole person rather than just the symptoms, understanding that healing happened in community rather than isolation. Michael's medical practice treated individual patients one at a time, important work that helped people recover from illness and injury. But my work had created systems that helped thousands of veterans recover from invisible wounds that were just as real and potentially deadly as any physical trauma. The difference was that my work happened in conference rooms and policy meetings rather than examination rooms, in legislative hearings, in nonprofit boardrooms rather than hospital corridors. Sarah's legal career involved winning cases for clients who could afford her services, protecting their interests and advancing their goals within the existing legal framework. But my work had actually changed laws and policies that affected entire populations of veterans and their families. I had helped draft legislation that improved veteran benefits, testified in support of bills that expanded mental health services, and worked with congressional staff to ensure that the people who served our country received the support they had earned through their sacrifice. The recognition Colonel Martinez was building toward represented validation from a community that understood the true meaning of leadership and service. People who measured worth not by the size of someone's house or the prestige of their job title, but by the depth of their commitment to making life better for others. The applause that was beginning to build in the room came from hands that belonged to people who had dedicated their lives to service, who understood that the highest calling was not personal success but collective well-being. I could see my family's faces starting to show confusion as Colonel Martinez's speech became more specific, as he began to describe accomplishments that sounded increasingly familiar, achievements that seemed to echo conversations they might have overheard if they had been paying attention to anything beyond their own narrow definitions of success. Sarah's expression was shifting from polite attention to something that looked almost like recognition, as if pieces of a puzzle she didn't know she was solving were starting to fall into place. Michael was leaning forward now, with genuine interest rather than networking calculation, his medical training making him more attuned to the healthcare aspects of what Colonel Martinez was describing, the veteran mental health innovations that had been implemented in hospitals across the country, including the one where he worked. His face showed the beginning of understanding, the dawning awareness that the work being praised was happening in his own professional world, connected to programs he had probably encountered without knowing their origin. The moment was approaching when Colonel Martinez would call my name, when the abstract hero he had been describing would become concrete and personal, when my family would be forced to confront the reality that the brother and son they had dismissed as a failure had actually been building something extraordinary while they weren't paying attention. The anticipation in the room was building toward a revelation that would change everything they thought they knew about success, about worth, about what it meant to make a meaningful contribution to the world. I straightened my shoulders and prepared to stand when my name was called, ready to accept recognition from people who mattered, from a community that understood the difference between achievement and accomplishment, between building wealth and building hope. The dress uniform felt like armor against years of family disappointment. Each ribbon and medal a testament to choices that had led not to corner offices and suburban mansions, but to something far more valuable than either Sarah or Michael had ever imagined possible. Colonel Martinez paused at the podium, his eyes scanning the room until they found mine, and I saw the slight nod of recognition that meant the moment of truth was finally at hand. The moment when years of quiet service would be acknowledged publicly and my family's carefully constructed narrative about my failures would crumble like Sarah's champagne glass was about to do in just a few more heartbeats. Colonel Martinez's voice carried across the ballroom with the crisp precision of a man who had spent decades delivering news that changed lives. And when he spoke my full name and rank into the microphone, followed by a list of accomplishments that made the entire room rise to their feet in sustained applause, I watched my sister's champagne glass slip from her fingers as if it were happening in slow motion, the crystal shattering against the marble floor in a sound that seemed to echo through years of assumptions and misunderstandings. I stood and walked toward the podium with the measured pace I had learned in ceremonies where dignity mattered more than speed, where every step represented not just personal honor, but the respect due to everyone who had served alongside me in places where courage was measured not in quarterly reports or billable hours, but in split-second decisions that meant someone else's child would come home for Christmas. The applause continued as I moved through the crowd, and I could see faces I recognized from veteran organizations, from Department of Defense meetings, from congressional hearings where my testimony had helped shape policies that would affect thousands of families. Sarah's face had gone completely pale, her mouth slightly open as she stared at me walking past her table in a dress uniform that told stories she was only now beginning to understand. Ribbons and medals that represented a level of service and sacrifice she had dismissed as youthful irresponsibility and poor life choices. Michael was standing with the rest of the room, but his applause had faltered, his hands frozen halfway together as his medical training helped him recognize some of the commendations on my chest, decorations that were only awarded for actions under fire, for saving lives in circumstances that most people never face. Colonel Martinez was reading from a citation that detailed my work establishing veteran mental health protocols now used in hospitals across 3 states, describing my role in developing crisis intervention programs that had prevented hundreds of veteran suicides, explaining how my consulting work had revolutionized the way military hospitals approach treatment for combat trauma. Every word was a revelation to my family, who were learning for the first time that their disappointing brother had been quietly saving lives while they thought he was wasting his own. When I reached the podium and shook Colonel Martinez's hand, accepting the Crystal Award that recognized my contributions to veteran affairs, I could see my family's table clearly in the sea of faces below. Sarah had sunk back in her chair, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the shock that was transforming her features as she realized that every assumption she had made about my life for the past 8 years had been completely wrong. Her husband was leaning over to whisper questions she clearly couldn't answer, asking how she had never mentioned that her brother was apparently some kind of war hero. Michael was still standing, but his face showed the kind of confusion that comes when a medical professional realizes they have fundamentally misdiagnosed a situation, when all the symptoms they thought they understood actually pointed to something entirely different from what they had assumed. His wife was looking between him and me with obvious bewilderment, probably wondering why he had never mentioned that his brother was being honored at community events for contributions that were apparently significant enough to warrant recognition from military leadership. Colonel Martinez invited me to say a few words to the audience, and as I stepped to the microphone, I could feel the weight of years of family disappointment lifting from my shoulders, replaced not by vindictive satisfaction, but by the quiet peace that comes from finally being seen for who you actually are rather than who people assume you must be. I looked out at the crowd of community leaders, veterans, and supporters who had gathered to celebrate service that often goes unrecognized, and I chose my words carefully, knowing that this moment would define not just how my family saw me, but how I chose to handle the gift of public vindication. I spoke about the privilege of serving alongside people who understood that true strength shows itself not in personal achievement, but in lifting others up, about the honor of working with veterans who had sacrificed their own comfort and safety so that others could live in peace, about the responsibility that comes with being trusted to help heal invisible wounds that are just as real and dangerous as any physical injury. I talked about the importance of community support for those who serve, about how everyone in that room played a role in ensuring that veterans received the care and respect they had earned through their sacrifice. I did not mention my family's misconceptions about my life, did not use this platform to settle scores, or embarrass people who had hurt me with their assumptions and dismissal. Instead, I focused on the work itself, on the thousands of veterans who had benefited from programs that existed because people in this room understood that supporting those who serve is not a political position, but a moral obligation that transcends partisan divisions and personal comfort zones. When I finished speaking and returned to my seat, the applause was longer and warmer than before, filled with the appreciation of people who recognize that grace under pressure is one of the highest forms of leadership, that choosing dignity over revenge demonstrates the kind of character that makes real change possible in the world. I could see my family's table clearly as I walked back through the crowd, and their faces showed the beginning of a reckoning that would probably take years to fully process. Sarah was crying now, not the elegant tears that sometimes appear during emotional moments at family gatherings, but the kind of deep, body-shaking sobs that come when someone realizes they have been fundamentally wrong about something important, when the foundation of their understanding shifts so dramatically that everything they thought they knew has to be reconsidered. Her husband was rubbing her back with the helpless confusion of someone who had married into family dynamics he was only now beginning to understand. Michael had finally sat down, but his hands were trembling as he reached for his water glass, his medical training probably making him acutely aware of his own physiological response to shock, the way his body was processing the revelation that his brother had been saving lives professionally while he thought he was treating a lost cause personally. His wife was asking quiet questions that he clearly didn't have answers for, wondering how she had been married into this family for 3 years without knowing that her brother-in-law was apparently a distinguished veteran and recognized community leader. As the evening continued with other presentations and recognition ceremonies, I could see my family struggling to process what they had learned, try to reconcile years of assumptions with a reality that was being presented to them by people whose authority they couldn't question. Their mother, who had been part of the Christmas band decision, was not at this event, but they would have to explain to her how they had spent years dismissing a son who was actually bringing honor to the family name in ways they had never bothered to investigate or understand. During the reception that followed the formal ceremony, community leaders and fellow veterans approached me with congratulations and stories about how my work had affected their organizations, their families, their own understanding of what effective veteran support could look like when designed by someone who understood both the military experience and the civilian systems that needed to adapt to serve that population effectively. Each conversation was a reminder that the work mattered more than family recognition, that external validation was meaningful only when it came from people who shared your values and understood your mission. Sarah approached me during a quiet moment when I was standing near the Christmas tree, her face still showing the evidence of tears, but her posture suggesting she was trying to find courage to say something that had never been easy for her to express. She stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak privately, but far enough to give both of us space to maintain dignity in what was clearly going to be a difficult conversation for someone who had spent years being wrong about something fundamental. She started to apologize, but I stopped her gently, explaining that understanding who someone really is often takes time, that families sometimes see each other through filters created by old patterns and expectations that don't leave room for growth and change. I told her that I wasn't angry about the Christmas ban, that I understood why my life had seemed directionless to people who measured success differently than I did, that the work I had chosen required a kind of discretion that made it difficult to explain to people who weren't part of that world. Michael joined us after a few minutes, bringing his wife, so she could be introduced properly to the brother-in-law she was meeting for the first time despite 3 years of family gatherings where my absence had never been adequately explained. He shook my hand with the firm grip of someone trying to communicate respect and regret simultaneously, his medical training probably helping him understand that some wounds take time to heal even when both parties want reconciliation. They asked questions about my work, about the programs I had developed, about how long I had been involved in veteran affairs, and why I had never talked about it during family gatherings that now seemed embarrassingly shallow in retrospect. I explained that much of my work required security clearances that made casual conversation about it impossible, that the consulting contracts involved classified information that couldn't be discussed with people who didn't have official need to know, that I had learned to separate my professional life from my personal relationships as a matter of both legal obligation and practical necessity. Michael mentioned that his hospital had implemented some of the mental health protocols I had developed, that he had been impressed with their effectiveness, but had never known they were designed by someone in his own family, that the veteran crisis intervention training he had completed was apparently based on my research and recommendations. The irony was not lost on any of us that he had been benefiting professionally from work I was doing while personally dismissing me as someone who couldn't figure out how to build a meaningful career. Sarah admitted that her law firm had recently taken on pro bono cases involving veteran disability claims, using resources and legal strategies that had been developed by organizations I had helped fund and establish, that she had been impressed with the quality and effectiveness of the Veteran Advocacy Network without knowing that her own brother had played a role in creating the systems that made that advocacy possible. The work she thought was meaningless had actually been supporting the kind of legal aid that her firm now considered important enough to donate time and resources to. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, my family lingered near the coat check, clearly struggling with how to end a night that had changed everything they thought they knew about family dynamics and personal worth. They invited me to join them for late dinner, to continue conversations that had barely started, to begin the process of rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by years of misunderstanding and assumptions that had never been challenged or examined. I accepted their invitation with the same grace I had brought to accepting the award, understanding that reconciliation is often more difficult than conflict, that building new relationships on the foundation of old disappointments requires patience and forgiveness from everyone involved. We went to a quiet restaurant that stayed open late for people who needed time to process conversations that couldn't be rushed or forced into neat conclusions. Over coffee and a dessert that stretched past midnight, we talked about the past 8 years from perspectives none of us had fully understood before, about choices that had looked like failures from one angle but revealed themselves as service when viewed from another direction, about the difference between success that impresses strangers and work that actually makes the world better for people who need help the most. They apologized for the Christmas ban, for years of treating me like a family embarrassment, for assumptions that had been based on their own narrow definitions of achievement rather than any real understanding of what I was actually doing with my life. I accepted their apologies while explaining that holding grudges would dishonor the example set by veterans who had forgiven far greater injuries in service of building better relationships with former enemies. That family healing was more important than family history when it came to creating the kind of future we all wanted to share. Sarah asked if I would come to Christmas dinner at her house the following week, if we could start over with new understanding of who we all were and what we each brought to the family table. Michael offered to help me connect with other doctors who might benefit from the veteran mental health training I had developed, suggesting that his professional network might provide opportunities to expand programs that were clearly making a difference in ways he was only beginning to appreciate. I agreed to Christmas dinner while making it clear that I hoped they would also consider joining me for volunteer work at the veteran shelter, that understanding my life would require seeing the world through the eyes of people they had never met, spending time with veterans whose stories would help them understand why I had chosen service over conventional success, why I measured worth differently than they had been taught to measure it. We parted that night with hugs that felt different from the obligatory embraces of previous family gatherings. Connections based on new understanding rather than old expectations. Relationships that would have to be rebuilt carefully over time, but had the foundation of truth rather than assumption supporting them now. They finally knew who I really was, and I finally had family members who were interested in learning more about the work that gave my life meaning rather than trying to change me into someone who would make them feel more comfortable at social gatherings. The drive home took me past houses where Christmas lights were still burning, past the restaurant where my family had celebrated without me just hours earlier, past the apartment building where I would spend the hour. Est of Christmas night reading emails from veteran organizations thanking me for support that had helped them expand programs that were saving lives in ways that would never make newspaper headlines, but mattered more than any recognition ceremony could capture. I fell asleep that night thinking not about vindication or family reconciliation, but about the work that would continue tomorrow, about veterans who still needed support, about programs that could be improved. About the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing that your life has been spent in service to something larger than yourself, something that would continue making a difference long after award ceremonies and family dinners had been forgotten. The Christmas ban had ended not because I had demanded inclusion or proven my worth through public recognition, but because the truth about who I was and what I did with my life had finally emerged in a setting where it could be seen clearly by people who mattered to me, where my family could understand that different kinds of success serve different kinds of purposes, that the path I had chosen led to destinations they had never imagined but were finally ready to respect and support.